They knocked at 11:08 on a Wednesday night, and when he opened the door, they did not introduce themselves. The first officer put his shoulder into the door before it was fully open and said, "Step back," and the man inside stepped back. And then there were two of them in the room and a third in the hallway, and the first one was already looking past him at the desk, the open laptop, the stacked file folders, the notepad covered in handwriting, the government-issued identification card sitting in its leather sleeve next to the phone. The first officer said, "We've had a complaint." The man asked what kind of complaint. The officer said, "A noise complaint from the adjacent room." The man said he had been working in silence for 4 hours. The officer said, "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." The man said he was not going anywhere until he understood why, and reached for the leather sleeve with the ID card inside it. The second officer took hold of his left arm. The man said, "Don't." The second officer did not let go. What happened in the next 90 seconds is on the hotel's corridor camera. A man in a gray undershirt and dark slacks, barefoot, pulled through the door of room 214 at the Meridian Inn on Callaway Street in Memphis, Tennessee at 11:09 p.m. On the 14th of March, while the leather sleeve with the ID card inside stayed on the desk next to the phone. On the desk, open to page 47, was a preliminary audit report concerning the Memphis Police Department's use of force documentation practices for the period of January 2021 through December 20th, 23. The preliminary findings were not favorable. The man who had been writing them was the auditor who had been sent to write them. What they did not know, and what the desk in room 214 had been telling anyone willing to read it for the last 11 days, would take them approximately 6 hours to understand. Those 6 hours changed a great many things, but they did not change what had already been recorded. His name was Dubem Chukwuemeka Okafor, and he was 46 years old, and he had been a senior auditor with the United States Department of Justice, Office of the Inspector General, for 14 years. It was 5'10", 181 pounds, with a build that had thinned in the last 2 years from the schedule that an audit of this size required. The kind of thinning that shows in the collar and the wrists, and that his mother Ngozi had noticed at Christmas and commented on, without subtlety. He wore his hair cut close, kept his face clean-shaven, and in 14 years of field audits in 11 different states had developed the particular spareness of a person who packs for efficiency and moves through cities the way you move through a report, systematically, without sentiment, covering what needs to be covered. He smelled of the unscented soap provided by the Meridian Inn and, faintly, of the printer toner that had been running on the portable document printer on the credenza since 7 p.m., turning audit data into pages that could be held and annotated and argued with. Room 214 had been his office for 11 days. He had grown up in the Westwood neighborhood of Cincinnati, Ohio, the only child of Emeka and Ngozi Okafor, who had arrived from Onitsha in 1976, and had made, between them, the specific kind of life that is built not from luck, but from the disciplined refusal to accept any outcome they had not examined first. Emeka had worked for 27 years as an accountant at a manufacturing firm on Spring Grove Avenue, auditing the firm's internal financials with the same patient thoroughness that a cabinet maker brings to a joint. Everything flush, everything true, everything documented. He had retired in 2009 with a letter of commendation from the CEO and the knowledge which he shared with Dubem on the drive home from the retirement dinner. That an honest set of books was not just a professional standard but a form of protection for the company, for the shareholders, and most importantly for the person whose name was on the audit. "Your name is on the work," Emeka had said, sitting at a red light on Galbraith Road. "Always remember that. Your name is on the work." Dubem had been 29 years old. He had been with the Inspector General's office for 1 year. He had never forgotten it. Ngozi had worked for 31 years as a home health aide, serving elderly patients in the College Hill and Clifton neighborhoods of Cincinnati. 6 days a week, 48 weeks a year. Carrying a bag that contained everything she might need: blood pressure cuffs, wound care supplies, reading glasses she kept for the patients who could not remember where they had put theirs, a small tin of the almond biscuits she baked on Sundays because some of her patients had nobody who baked for them, and she had decided, 31 years ago and without fanfare, that this was something she could fix. She had retired in 2018 at the age of 67. And at her retirement gathering, tres of her former patients' adult children came and said the same thing in different words, that she had been the person their parent had most looked forward to seeing. Dubem had stood at the back of that room and listened to them say it, and had understood something he had not articulated before about what a life of service actually looked like when it was done, without asking to be noticed. The audit that had brought him to the Meridian Inn in Memphis was not his first investigation into a law enforcement agency. In 14 years, he had conducted or co-led 9 separate audits of municipal police departments across the country, covering everything from asset forfeiture practices to internal affairs documentation to overtime billing. He had a reputation within the Inspector General's office for 2 things: a finding rate that his supervisor called consistent and his colleagues called relentless, and a writing style in his reports that stripped every conclusion down to the minimum language required to state it precisely. No rhetoric, no exaggeration. No concession to the feeling of the finding, only the finding itself, stated in terms that could be cited. It had been sent to Memphis in response to a referral from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, which had flagged anomalies in the Memphis Police Department's use of force documentation for a 3-year period. The anomalies were numerous. Dubem had been in room 214 for 11 days, and he had documented 61 of them. The file folders on the desk at 11:08 p.m. contained, among other things, printed copies of 847 use of force incident reports from the Memphis Police Department for the period under review, with annotations in blue pen in Dubem's handwriting. A comparison tables showing the discrepancy between the reported outcomes in those documents and the parallel records from the city's medical examiner's office for the same period. A preliminary findings memo addressed to the Assistant Inspector General that ran to 62 pages. And, on the top of the left-hand pile, a printed email exchange from 8 days prior between Dubem and the Memphis Police Department's legal counsel, in which the department's lawyer had requested a delay in the audit timeline, and Dubem had declined, in 3 sentences in language that his supervisor would later describe as appropriate. On the right side of the desk, beside the phone and the leather ID sleeve, was a secure laptop connected to the DHO's encrypted internal server. The laptop had been open and active at the moment the officers knocked. Its screen showed page 47 of the preliminary findings. Page 47 documented a pattern. The hotel's night manager on duty was a woman named Pauline Osu-Mensah, who was 51 years old and had been working at the Meridian Inn for 8 years and had seen, in those 8 years, a considerable range of situations that the training materials for hotel night managers did not cover. She had been at the front desk when the 2 officers arrived at 11:02 p.m. and asked for the room number of the guest in 214. She had told them because the officers did not present a warrant and she did not know she could ask for one, and because in her 8 years of experience, the people who came to the front desk at 11:02 p.m. with badges were generally responding to something that required her cooperation. She had given them the room number and watched them cross the lobby and step into the elevator. And then she had stood at the desk for 3 seconds before picking up the house phone and dialing room 214. Because something about the way the first officer had walked had told her that the cooperation she had just provided might not have been the right kind. The call connected to room 248 at 11:07. She heard the knock at the door through the phone. She heard the door open. She kept the line open, set the handset on the counter face up, and went to the corridor camera monitor at her station on the 2nd floor and watched it for the next 4 minutes. And what she watched made her pick up her own cell phone and call the Meridian Inn's corporate security director. In the corridor outside room 214, a man named Joseph, a traveling salesman from Knoxville in room 216, who had been returning from the vending machine at the end of the hall with a bottle of water and a pack of crackers, when the officers passed him, had stopped and watched from 12 feet away. It was 43 years old and white and had his water and his crackers, and he watched them knock on the door, and he watched what happened when it opened. He watched the door pushed inward. He watched the 3rd officer in the hallway, who had not gone inside. He stood 12 feet away, and he did not say anything, and he did not do anything, and after 90 seconds he went back to his room, and the door to room 216 closed. And the corridor was quiet, except for the sounds coming from inside room 214. A would be checked out of the Meridian Inn and back on the highway to Knoxville before anyone thought to ask him what he had seen. The third officer, the one who had stayed in the corridor, was a man named Salter. A was 26 years old and had been on the force for 14 months and had spent the evening as the junior member of the team, which meant he had spent the evening doing what the senior officers directed. He had positioned himself in the corridor as directed. A had looked at the open door to room 214 and the desk visible through it, the stacked folders, the open laptop, the government ID in its leather sleeve, and had not said anything. He had watched the desk the way you watch something you don't yet understand, which is the same way you watch it when you do understand, and have decided not to speak. It is not possible to say, from the outside, which one it was. The route from the Meridian Inn on Calloway Street to the precinct intake area was 11 minutes by car. Dubin rode in the back of the patrol car in his gray undershirt and dark slacks, with his bare feet on the floor mat and his hands cuffed in front of him, not behind, which was a small procedural concession the first officer had made after Dubem stated calmly and precisely that the cuffing of a federal officer in the course of a lawful assignment was an action with specific legal consequences, and that he would like them documented. Had said it the way he said everything, in the minimum number of words required to state it clearly. Officer Bray, who was driving, said nothing in response. Officer Hollis, in the passenger seat, said, "We had a complaint." Dubem said, "From whom?" Holly said, "The adjacent room." Dubem said, "Room 212 has been vacant for 4 days. He can hear the housekeeping card stop at occupied rooms, and it has not stopped at 212 since last Saturday. You can verify that with the front desk." Neither officer said anything after that. The car drove 11 minutes in silence. The intake area of the precinct smelled of burnt coffee and the particular industrial disinfectant that institutional floors acquire over decades, and it was lit by fluorescent lights that gave the room the same quality as the underside of an overpass on a rainy night. Functional, without warmth, designed for visibility rather than comfort. A television mounted in the upper corner of the room was showing a late sports broadcast with the sound off. Dubem sat in the intake chair and did not speak and did not look at the television. He looked at a point on the wall approximately 8 feet in front of him, and he thought about page 47 and what came after it, and how much of the analysis for pages 48 through. Finte, one had completed before the knock at the door. He had been in the middle of a sentence on page 49. He knew what the sentence was. He knew how it ended. He was not going to forget how it ended. He had 41 minutes in the intake area, and he spent them the way he spent time that could not be used for the work itself, by organizing the work in his head, which was a form of preparation, which was what preparation was for. Pauline put the handset back in the cradle and picked up her cell phone and called the Meridian Inn's corporate security director, whose number was on the laminated card taped to the inside of the desk drawer. She had looked at that card perhaps 100 times in 8 years and never called the number on it. And her voice was steady when the line picked up, because she was a woman who had learned that the steadier your voice, the faster you are heard. And this was a moment that required being heard quickly. If what's building in this story is doing something to your blood pressure, stay with me. Because what happens when the desk in room 214 gets read is the part that doesn't leave you. The corporate security director called the Meridian Inn's legal counsel at 11:19 p.m. The legal counsel called the DAJO's duty line at 11:23. The duty officer who took the call was a woman named Constance Adyemi Ngozi, 11 years in the Inspector General's office. Ho verified Duben's assignment and credentials in 40 seconds and then made 3 calls in the following 9 minutes to the Assistant Inspector General on duty, to the Department of Justice's Office of Liaison with State and Local Law Enforcement, and to the United States Attorney for the Western District of Tennessee. What happened next had the quality of something moving through a system that was not designed for the direction it was moving. The first call from the U.S. Attorney's Office reached the precinct captain at 11:47 p.m. The captain called the watch commander. The watch commander walked to the intake area and looked at Dubem Okafor, sitting in the chair in his gray undershirt and dark slacks and bare feet, and said nothing for a moment. He looked at the processing paperwork on the intake officer's desk. He picked it up and read it. He set it back down. It turned and walked back toward the watch commander's office, and then stopped and turned around and stood in the doorway and said, "Nobody touch anything in that intake." He went into his office and made a call. The call lasted 6 minutes. The desk sergeant came to the intake area at 12:41 a.m. and said, "Who processed the guy from the Meridian?" A pause. Then the officer who had processed him raised his hand. The desk sergeant said, process him." He said it in the flat voice of a man who understands that the only direction available is backward and has accepted it. It was 3 years from his pension, and this was not how he had planned to spend the 14th of March. Dubem was returned to room 2014 at 1:04 a.m. The hotel's night manager, Pauline, had kept his room key behind the desk and had a fresh pot of coffee running in the lobby before he came back through the door. She handed him the key and looked at his wrists where they had been cuffed and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the coffee couldn't say better. He thanked her. It took the coffee. He went upstairs. The laptop was still open on the disk. Page 47 was still on the screen. The secure connection had timed out and required re-authentication, which he did, and then he sat down and picked up his pen and found his place on the legal pad and continued. It worked until 4:17 a.m. The preliminary findings memo was submitted to the Assistant Inspector General at 9 a.m. On the following Monday, 62 pages, bearing Dubem Okafor's name on the cover page beneath the seal of the Department of Justice. It documented 61 anomalies in the Memphis Police Department's use of force records for the 3-year period under review. It documented a pattern of underreporting of injuries in use of force incidents involving Black residents, a discrepancy between reported outcomes and medical examiner records in 34 of the 847 reviewed incidents, and a systemic failure in the department's internal review mechanisms that had allowed the discrepancy to persist across 3 consecutive years. The memo recommended a formal DHO investigation under the Pattern or Practice Authority of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. That recommendation was accepted. The events of Room 214 were documented separately in a 2-page addendum that Dubem submitted along with the memo. The addendum was factual, chronological, unattached to the hotel corridor camera footage and Pauline's signed statement and the phone record from the Meridian Inn's front desk showing the line to room 214 that she had kept open. The addendum was referred to the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility for review of the officer's conduct and to the city's Corporation Counsel for assessment of liability. 3 officers were named in the referral: Officers T. Bray, K. Hollis, and D. Salter. All 3 were placed on administrative reassignment pending review within 9 days of the referral. The review was opened. It remained open. What Dubem Okafor said publicly about the events of March 14th was limited to 1 paragraph, included in a written statement released through the Inspector General's office 6 weeks after the audit was submitted, that he had been detained without lawful basis in the course of a federal audit, that the detention had not affected the findings of the audit, that the preliminary report had been submitted on schedule, and that the matter of the detention was being addressed through the appropriate channels. He did not characterize his experience. As stated facts. His name was on the statement, and his name was on the work, and what was on the work was what mattered. His father, Emeka, who was 75 years old and still woke at 6 a.m., every morning by the habit of 40 years, read the statement in the Cincinnati Enquirer on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table on Spring Grove Avenue with his coffee. He read it once, and then he read it again, and then he folded the paper along the crease and set it on the table and put his hand flat on top of it. He sat with his hand on the folded paper for a long time, the way you sit with something when you need to feel that it is real and solid and in front of you before you can accept that it happened and that it is over. The kitchen smelled of the egusi soup Nosy had been making since 7 a.m., which was a smell that meant Sunday, but she made it on Saturdays when she felt the family needed it, whether or not they were all there to eat it. Emeka sat at the table, and he thought about Galbraith Road and the red light and what he had said to his son in 2009. And he thought about whether he had been right to say it, and whether the weight of it had served Dubem or cost him something, and he decided, as he had decided many times in the years since, that a principle is not a burden unless you carry it wrong. Dubem had never carried it wrong. Then he picked up his coffee and drank it, and after a while he called his son's name toward the next room, and Nosy came to the doorway with the wooden spoon, and he showed her the paragraph. There are institutions that have operated for decades on the assumption that the records can be managed, that the paperwork can be shaped, that what the documentation says can be made to serve the needs of the institution rather than the truth of what occurred. They have been correct about this for a long time. They have been correct about it because the people sent to examine them have, until the moment they are not, been manageable, delayed, discouraged, intimidated, or simply never sent. What they cannot manage is a man who has spent 14 years building the discipline to state only what the evidence supports, who learned from his father that his name is on the work, who worked until 4:17 in the morning on the night they took him from his room, who came back, sat down, and found his place on the legal pad. You cannot audit a person's character. You cannot detain their preparation. You cannot take them from the room at 11:09 p.m. and leave the work on the desk and expect, when they return at 1:04 a.m., to find the work changed. The work does not change. The work waits. The sentence on page 49 waited the same way it had been waiting all evening, in the precise form it had been given, in the order, the evidence required, with his name above it and every word of it meaning exactly what it said. There are people in your life who have been put through something designed to stop them. A threat, a humiliation, a door closed on their credentials, a night spent in a room they were not supposed to be in, and who came back the next morning and did the work anyway. Who never asked to be celebrated for continuing. Who understood that continuing was simply what the work required. What they were counting on is that eventually, the person with the notepad runs out of patience, runs out of time, runs out of something. What they had not counted on is a man whose father told him, at a red light on Galbraith Road in 2009, that his name is on the work, always. His name is on the work. If someone has ever tried to remove you from something you were building, a report, a case, a record, a truth, leave your answer in the comments. What did they use to try to stop you? And what made you go back? Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people this world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.